Hello, welcome to Philosophy All Along. So, I want to talk with you about a movie that a lot of people argue about over the holidays, and it's Die Hard, right? There's this, I think, very fun argument about whether or not it's a Christmas film, and I'm not going to weigh in on that today. If you ever want me to, let me know in the comments. I definitely do have my own theory about it. But the reason why I want to talk with you about it is because it's, in a lot of ways, if you don't mind a lot of gratuitous violence, a very fun film. And you can watch it kind of during the holidays. I think partly for fun of asking yourself, wait, does this count? Like that's part of the game that you can play. And so I want to start with I do enjoy the film. I don't know if I should be ashamed to admit that, given its gratuitous violence, but I do think that it does a lot of things very smartly. So I think that there's a lot of really like smart relationships in it that maybe you don't always get out of an action film, right? So that someone who's watching the movie who's maybe kind of like a little bit not into, okay, well, here's another fight scene, get to see moments of concern and development in a relationship, because some people are more relationship oriented. So the relationship between Holly and John, and how that relationship is struggling or developing, and how the film depicts that development, right? The relationship between Al and John is a really important one, and honestly, actually speaks to a lot of soldiers in war and the way that they experience something together that nobody else kind of around them can understand. And so, I do think that the film uh, really does some very, very, very smart things, kind of groundbreaking at the time, certainly. And I think even for like action films now, is able to weave some other strands of a little bit of mystery, a little bit of a kind of crime narrative into it, a little bit of there's some turning points of you're like, oh, that's a surprise, right? And also relationships that are all very, very smart. So I want to start with I do think, in fact, that it is a good film and it is well made. And now I just want to criticize the heck out of it. So forgive me for that. So that's not me criticizing you if you enjoy it. That's me saying I think that the film is really capitalizing off of something. Like, so my watching it most recently, it really just stood out to me how much this film is about like male castration terror, right? So this kind of almost like Freudian fear of losing one's penis. And don't worry, I'm not going to spend too much time saying penis. That's not, I think, the main focus of today's conversation, but I mean that in a more metaphorical sense of men losing their maleness, of men losing their manliness, whatever that happens to mean. So you have a film that was made in like the late 80s. And um, as my spouse and I were discussing, and our friend, we just rewatched it, that one of the interesting things about it is that you notice like in the 1980s you have all these weird like shows that have people like with military ordnance like driving around the street in a city, so you got like Airwolf and the A Team, but you also have things like MacGyver even, right? Like it's strange, right? Like, and we couldn't help but wonder like, well, maybe some of this is because so many of particularly men at the time had served or had been around for like Vietnam and Korea, and they were now, back home watching TV, into their maybe their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, and there's a bit of nostalgia, but also safety in terms of like, oh, I've experienced warfare. These are ways in which are kind of not PTSD inducing, seeing that, what I did was awesome and the stuff I was working with was awesome, but also everyone turns out okay. So I think Die Hard is touching on something, though, kind of even deeper in the male psyche than that, in terms of this kind of metaphorical castration terror. What I mean is that you've seen now all of these people in the manosphere, all these people who consider themselves, like they're incels, and this idea of cuck language and all of this stuff, that there's this profound terror amongst men that they are losing their positioning. And people are like, no, 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 that's just feminist. No, no. I mean, but when you talk with these people or you read what they're writing, you see that there's this idea that they are losing sex, that they're losing access to women and things that honestly they have no right to. Like, no one has a right to anyone else's body, no one has a right to power, no one has these rights, no one just deserves it because of their anatomy or their social status or something like that. But I think this film, it was interesting because, like, usually I think about it recently, right? In other words, like all of these guys who are kind of running around, kind of in the MAGA world and in the Joe Rogan world of like, oh, my manliness is being threatened. It's like, dude, you're okay, you're all right. Like, everyone's okay in that regard, right? Toxic masculinity is apparently not going anywhere. And in fairness, like, if you were a little bit more inclusive, you'd be amazed how many people also enjoy like shooting and blowing things up and these kinds of dominant activities. There's a lot of women who would love to join you out in the out paintballing or whatever it is that you're doing. But it's that need to feel like, well, it's only ours and it's my space, and I have that my having that space gives me a right to something. And man, do I think that Die Hard really touched on that a long time ago. And I think that's why it has this like cultural importance and kind of like belovedness, because really, like, think about it, just watching the film basically begins with a guy in terror, right? It begins with a guy who's afraid. Um, he's there on the plane and he's scared. It's something that he's out of power on, right? He lacks control in the plane. There's some other guy, right, who is flying the plane. So there's this idea of he's like cuckolded just there by being present. And interestingly enough, and this is a stretch, so we don't have to go down this particular road, but I've heard way back in the day this argument that planes were shaped in ways that were supposed to resemble like a breast or the bosom in order to like make people feel calmer. I don't know if any of that's true, but there he is in this feminized space where you're all kind of a community together, right? He's got another guy telling him what to do. Well, here's how you relax. And John's feeling kind of condescended to. Well, I've been doing this forever. But then you see he's got a gun, right? He's got his he's got his phallus there with him, right? And the guy is kind of scared now, like, oh, I'm actually in danger of this. Like, so he gets to assert his masculinity despite being in this scary space. But what was really the scariest space that John is in that moment? Well, he's in the space of trying to go get his relationship, right? He's the one who has to go to his woman, right? She's not coming to him. He's going to her, and he's going with basically like an apology present, right? He's going with this bear. So there he is, this strong man carrying around a teddy bear, like this weak little guy, this big teddy bear. And think about it. What's great was really about it being brilliant about it being a big teddy bear is it makes him look small, right? So it's all of these ways in which he's being made smaller, right? He gets into the vehicle that's being driven for him, and he still has to be near the driver's seat, right? And it's a way of showing that he's a man of the people, right? Like, he's not in the back being driven around, but also I think it's a sign of like, well, I don't want someone else driving me. I should be the one driving. I'm the man. The man drives, but he's being driven, and it's emasculating for him, right? And then the guy who's talking to, who's really great, is also very pushy. He's engaging in what we tend to consider a feminine activity of talking. Talking about our experiences, talking about the things that are happening to us, and the guy kind of, Argyle, right, kind of forces him to talk about his relationship experience, which is something that men don't talk about. But Argyle's like, no, we're talking about this because he's a man. John's a man out of his depth, right? He's there in California where people, men are kissing other men, right? We see that scene shortly thereafter where this guy, like, kind of kisses him as a greeting, and he's like, oh, this is what a weird space. Everyone's more open, and bodies are more out, and masculinity is kind of more touchy. And anyways, so Argyle, we find out that this is such an important scene in the film. We find out that John is in a position where his wife has gotten this awesome job and has literally moved across the country, taken the children with her, and it has had a horrible impact on their marriage, right? And then John accuses her of this later on. But Argyle says something very important. I think this is one of the most important moments in the film. He says, you were expecting that she was going to give up, right? That she was going to realize that this whole thing was a mistake. She was, in essence, going to fail miserably and come kind of crawling back. But that's not what happened. Man, that's insightful, because even John points out, like, oh, you're quick, right? Like, he figured something out there, that there's a part of John that was kind of hoping that his wife would fail. Now that doesn't mean that he doesn't love Holly, and that doesn't mean that he actually wanted to fail. It means that he's in this position of like, well, this is my life, and I'm the man, and I provide for my family, and I'm out there risking my life as a cop, and my wife gets this awesome job and takes herself across the country, and what am I supposed to do? Just give up my job? Just give up my life? What about me? What about my needs, right? And I think he's probably struggling because he also knows that's selfish, that he should be supporting his wife, etc., etc. But then what happens? He gets to Nakatomi Plaza, and he sees that she's not using her married name, right? As she's listed as Holly Gennaro. And so this is another moment, not just of kind of emasculating, but also of him like losing something, right? Of something being cut out and being taken away from him, and his woman, right, no longer belonging to him. That yeah, and he sees that there's this other guy, right? Harry, I think, is like sniffing around her, like that he's interested, and so on and so forth. So again, this kind of cuckolding gesture, right? And over again, John is at the beginning of it placed in positions of lacking power, and placed in positions of losing his things that he probably defines himself as making him male, right? And so what I think is really kind of very smart about this is I think it tapped into something that men were really afraid of at the time in the 80s, and I think in a lot of ways still are now. Like, you don't really hear as much conversation about divorce. Like, it's a lot more normalized. You don't really hear like divorce as a phrase, but it's still there in terms of something that's used as a negative in some circles. So, like the guy who's been nominated to lead the Pentagon literally has written books about where he thinks that no fault divorce should be gotten rid of. And you can actually see in the process of his own wives leaving him how his books increasingly ratchet up the criteria for being able to get divorced. Like, he's like, well, it should be tougher to get divorced. And then his wife divorces him, and he's like, it should be even tougher to get divorced. So it's really just personal. These books aren't about society; they're about him, right? They're about him and his needs, and the fact that he can mistreat women, and they can leave him, and he doesn't want them to be able. So instead of improving himself and improving how he treats them, he just wants to make it illegal for them to leave so that they have to be stuck. And there's a part of John that's in that position, right? Like, I want to be, let's just call a spade, a kind of grunting, non-communicative guy who like has his hard job and works hard for his family, but doesn't really show much emotional vulnerability. And I just want to be able to do that, and I want you to stay. But instead, into the 1980s, women were starting to get more and more powerful in terms of their job offerings. They weren't just kind of after the various wars, just kind of going back home and tending to the children. They were going out there and they were being successful. And there's all these guys who were kind of, what if my wife gets a job better than mine? What if she's making more money than me? What if she leaves? What if she doesn't need me? Like, that your wife is just staying around for the money, right? Just staying around because she has to, because who else is going to take care of her, right? Holly doesn't need John, and she points it out that he couldn't handle when they're having their little argument, right? She points out how he couldn't handle the change in the relationship. She wasn't trying to end the relationship. She didn't want the relationship to end. She clearly misses him. And so he can't handle the change. He can't keep up with the change. He's unwilling to keep up with the change. And in fairness to John, there's a way and clearly in which he's trying, right? But she doesn't see that. And he has his own boundaries that he has to keep straight. He shouldn't have to grovel, right? So on and so forth. And so, anyways, the long and short of it is I think it spoke to this real terror that men were having at the time, like that the women in their lives didn't need them. And then they could just go, right? And that these other guys who could offer them Rolexes would be far more attractive to them. And then the rest of the film is just kind of this delusion, this wonderful fever dream in which this average guy living an average life, right, does all of these impossible things, right? And for those of you who truly love it, hear me when that I say that with all the most love, right? That one of the joys of watching action films and Marvel films and all of these like superhero epics and Star Wars is the impossibility, that the belief that something else amazing can happen. I mean, that's one of the things that I love so much about like even like the Lord of the Rings. It's just like sometimes I look at it and go, man, why can't we just like build and do awesome things like that, right? And so I think like so if we're honest with ourselves, like there's multiple times where really John would have died in these circumstances. But I think what the film really is doing is placing John and then us, the audience, but especially the male presenting audience and the male terrified audience, the all of the men out there who just feel like they're living like kind of like mundane lives and they're doing really important stuff, right? Like John's job is important. Like they're going and they're building stuff and they're doing stuff and they're working hard and their bodies are being beaten up and then they're being told in by their society like, oh well, I guess I'm supposed to be more emotionally connected to my spouse. I don't know how to do that because when I cried as a kid my dad would hit me, like so they feel like they're being asked a lot of really impossible things. And then all of a sudden they're also being told that women who always from the men's perspective always kind of had a superpower that they didn't, right? Women always know that their children are theirs by virtue of the fact that it comes screaming out of their bodies, right? The guys don't know that, and I think that that's led to a very long history of men oppressing women and oppressing women's reproduction and trying to control reproduction because men haven't always known for sure that it's their child, that they kind of have to hope, right? And so, well, the best way then to know for sure is to like lock her up, right? And so you hear that, right? You hear that chanting, lock her up. And what is a way? It's a way of controlling her reproduction, her breeding, making sure that you're the only man, etc., etc. Well, the film shows all of that fear by presenting a guy who's coming on to her and showing all of these other men who have power over Holly. And John, I think a great way to view this film is John comes to see his wife. There's a part he can't keep up with it, right? There's all these fake people with wealth doing all of these fake things, and he's there, with his, probably at the time, K-bar teddy bear. What does he have? He feels very inadequate. He doesn't realize how much his wife really does love him, how much she really wants him to understand that she can love him and also want her career and want to be successful, and she does want to figure out how to make this all work with him. He's there so busy in his insecurities he can't see that. And so what does he do? He engages in this total delusion of what if people came in and I was the only person who could save my wife? Then she would have to love me, right? And so then he goes through this whole thing of doing all of this impossible stuff, of getting to be a hero, reasserting his masculinity. He takes back the gun, right? The phallus, right? He's like, oh, now I have like my little gun wasn't enough. Now I have a big gun, right? And it's like, there's I think there's such an interesting moment where you have these kind of like pin-up, like these naked women, right? And these pin-ups are like both an indicator of like what was the 1980s, but also like an indicator of like him being a loyal man. Like he notices them and he approves it, but it's also like distant from him. But who's he really trying to save? He's there for his woman and he just needs his woman to see that. And he's at the same time developing this brotherhood with this other man who is also emasculated, right? That this guy has done this really tragic and horrible thing by accidentally killing a kid, right? And as a result, he has never been able to perform again. And so it's about them getting all of that power back. And by the end of the film, Holly has been like, no, I'm not Gennaro, I'm a McLean, right? And she has kind of resubmitted to the protective blanket of her husband. And Al now is virile again, right? And can protect everyone. And he's not shooting blanks, he's shooting effective bullets. So the long and short of it is the reason why I think that this is important reading is because if you look at the film in that way, I think that you can see a whole lot of why people are voting and thinking and speaking as they do, right? I don't mean it just as a criticism and I don't mean it just like to make fun. Like it's a fun romp. The movie is fun and it's really well done. But when you look at it from that perspective, you can also see how scared people are, like how like what this male terror really is, that you can build an entire film around men being afraid of losing not just their power in this like, well, we have control, but the men being afraid that they're going to lose the women in their lives, that they're going to lose their jobs, that they're going to lose their efficacy, that they're going to lose their importance, and whether or not you agree that that's reasonable, like, oh, is that really the case? Like, I get that. I hear that rebuttal, but it doesn't change the fact that fear is never reasonable, right? If your child's terrified, and not to like make children of men, but just as an example, if your child's terrified of the dark and you're like, well, that's stupid, that doesn't help them. Even if you know that there's nothing to be afraid of. And in all fairness, sometimes there actually is something scary in the dark. Sometimes there actually is something dangerous. And so the fear isn't always rational. And to be honest, every once in a while you find out, right? Like every once in a while there are these guys who find out that their wives did leave for the other job, and then they did start having an affair with someone else, and they are actually raising children that are not biologically theirs. And a fair number of guys out there are being willing to treat those children as theirs, which I think is a powerful gesture of like love and commitment and care to the most vulnerable amongst us, right? So is that common? No. But that societal terror in the background, like what happens to me while these other people are gaining power, was powerful enough, and I think remains powerful enough, but it was powerful enough for a whole movie franchise to be born out of it. Whether or not you agree with it, or whether or not you think men have any justification, that's a different argument. We should definitely have that conversation. But it's significant, and it's significant enough for it. It's not light, right? Right? It's not like this movie kind of gently gestures to the things. It's all about this guy not just regaining power and force, but virility, right? And in fairness to John, whatever criticisms we have of him and kind of the guys who are thinking like him, and these male fears and so on and so forth, it's important to remember that as much as men benefit from all of the sexisms that our society foists upon women, that these guys who are coming into the world are raised in it just as much as women are raised in it, that they're raised in it. It's not as if they sat down as a group. Like, it's not like the John McClanes of the world sat down as a group and said, you know what I'd really like to do, oppress some women today, right? They were raised in a world where they were taught this is what makes them a man, how they should act, how they should be, what they're entitled to, what their privileges are, right? And most of it hasn't even been said. It's just been embedded into their brains. And so these guys having that experience, literally, I don't think John knows how to find value in himself without this delusion of, well, the way to get my wife back is the terrorists, not terrorists, right? Breaking into the building and then me saving her, as opposed to like what actually what should, how it probably actually should go would be a much less exciting film, right? Like John goes there, probably with the teddy bear. Why not? You know, he goes there and he says, this has been really tough. This has been tough on me. Can we talk about it? Because I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose the kids. And what you're doing is important. I look around and I'll admit I feel really small. I feel unimportant in this space. And it's not your job to make me feel important. I don't know what to do, and I'd like this to work. Then they would talk it. We'd be like, oh, all right, that's not a Christmas movie, right? So, anyways, so that's my analysis. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Is it all just this, you know, castration fear, fever dream in which a man goes through great pains of getting his penis back? You let me know. Sorry to end it on that note. I hope you're enjoying your holidays, and please do comment. I love to respond politely, and like and subscribe, and share it share it with others. I guess if you want to have a silly time, I'd be curious to know if you have a conversation with someone else about what their experience with this film is, and if they see something similar, they see something really different. And pop it in the comments. I'd love to talk about it. All right, thanks so much, and